Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear colleagues and guests, welcome to this month's Ummatics Colloquium. My name is Mi'raj Sayed. I will be moderating today's session with our esteemed guest, Professor Oveimir Anjum and Professor Yasmin Daifullah. As you may know, the Ummatics Institute aims at empowering Muslims towards the realization of a unified Islamic civilization for the benefit of the Ummah and for the benefit of humanity at large. And our colloquium serves such a mission by steering academic conversation on chosen Ummatic topics. At the colloquium, we try to shed light on the themes that revolve around the questions of what does and what should Ummatic unity look like, and how do we get there? The themes we discuss are classified under the 6 categories of identity, people, social movements, in addition to state, regional, and global levels of analysis. These 6 categories offer us an opportunity to think about the ummah as a being that needs to be understood and nurtured on a micro, meso, and macro levels. Such levels generate research questions that help link the ummah down to the individual and the individual up to the ummah and all the intervening layers that make up the community. As part of our focus on ummatic unity, we're continuing a conversation that previous colloquiums tried to unpack the tension between the nation state and Muslim civil society. But today, we're going to take a deep dive into dealing with differences in the ummah, which often seem deep and wide and unbridgeable, and which are some of the most important obstacles to achieving unity. That's going to be the topic of the colloquium today. And we have not just one, but 2 guests that are going to be helping us think through and navigate this topic, this very important topic. One is well known to us, Professor Oveimir Anjum, and the other, Professor Yasmin Daifullah. So let me give you all a brief introduction of who they are. Professor Anjum is Professor Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo. Professor Daifullah is Assistant Professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her research and teaching specializes in Arab and Islamic political thought, post-colonial theory, critical theory, comparative political theory, and Middle East politics. Throughout the session, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box, and we will read them to the guests following the presentation. And as always, please visit our website and social media accounts to read new studies and get notified of upcoming events. Without further ado, Professor Anjum, the floor is yours.
All right, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Thank you very much, Mirad, for the generous introduction, and Yasmin for being here today and responding. I look forward to a really engaging conversation. The topic I have today is managing deep differences. And this is a topic that's very important to us at Ummatics since the very beginning of our enterprise. One of the questions that has come to us again and again is, how do you deal with deep differences among Muslims? Not quite posed in the same way. The question is posed often in terms of sectarianism, right? Shia-Sunni differences, or Sufi-Salafi differences, the madhab differences. This question is always posed by people, sometimes sincerely and sometimes not so, in order to make the point that secularism is necessary, that religion and truth and morality and values that come from revelation do not belong in the public sphere, because it's not possible for people who are religious to tolerate and work out a working, a good enough sort of working relationship with whom they disagree. So disagreement, this is, I remember earlier in the 20th century, the question that was posed in Pakistan, for example, when there is a question of an Islamic, the Islamic mandate in Pakistan and Sharia being applied, was how could, which madhab do you want to practice? Do you want to be Hanafi? Do you want to be Shafi'i? Do you want to be Ahl al-Hadith? And so intellectuals, secular intellectuals, often weaponized internal differences among Muslims, which, we have to be real, are sometimes deep and sometimes unmanageable and sometimes quite irrational and sometimes sublimated. So there are personal differences that have become sublimated, or interests that have become sublimated to religious language. And so the question is, they used to ask is why Islamic governance is impossible is because you guys cannot live together, that there must be a kind of a superior, rational, secular power that manages those differences for you. In fact, one of the arguments that is used to justify the rise of secularism in the West is Christian civil wars that went on for quite some time. There's Catholic and Protestant warfare that went on for some time. What's interesting, however, and what challenges this narrative is that when, after 1648, in Europe, the Catholic and Protestant warfare ended, it gave birth to, it immediately became just repackaged as nation-state warfare that went on for another century and a half. And then, there was colonialism, and after that, First World War, and Second World War. So we are living constantly is enormous violence, but religious violence is considered a reason to delegitimize religious government in the way that secular violence is not seen as sufficient to delegitimize secular governance, right? So that's, if you will, the framework, that the challenge that I think we should take seriously. Now, as Muslims, we are committed to living, living by God's law. And we have a tradition, 1400 years, where Muslims have sometimes done well, sometimes not so well, but on the whole, relatively comparative, compared to almost any other civilization, we have tolerated, not only tolerated, but allowed to flourish and thrive non-Muslim communities in our midst, and lived with differences among Muslims, often well. And some differences, such as legal differences, have been quite, in fact, systematically tolerated. So the Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali differences, legal differences, in fact, have been dealt with remarkably well, almost, one might say, exceptionally well in history of religions. But when it comes to sectarian differences and other deep differences that are deeply felt, such as, these days, for example, there is this emergence of this debate between Sufi and Salafi commentators on the Mawlid of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, celebration of the Prophet's birthday. And again, the issue that seems to be quite minor and marginal becomes so explosive on social media. So the question is, can we ever live together under one roof, if you will? And what are the transformations? What are the principles that we can use to move toward that eventuality? Given also that, apart from, one might say, what one might say to be perhaps trivial debates about Mawlid, there are very real problems in terms of a war, if you will, a Cold War between Sunni and Shia blocs of countries in the Muslim world, which seem to be allied to non-Muslim powers and against often each other. And so how could that ever be resolved? And I think that the answer requires understanding that the reasons for this for this sectarian politics is precisely the conditions of colonialism, post-colonialism, and conditions of constant manipulation of the Muslim world, and the very idea, the very creation of nation states, which are vociferous and which are divisive toward their neighbors by design. And so it so happens that sectarianism provides a useful way to categorize these differences and manipulate the masses, which is necessary in a modern nation state. So I'm not saying sectarianism is not a problem, but it is the modern secular politics that weaponizes differences among Muslims, and therefore it is necessary that Muslims go back to our tradition and understand the resources to manage those differences peacefully so that those differences cannot be weaponized, right? So that's my context or sort of framing. Now let me get to the 5 points I'm going to make about how we can manage deep differences, all right? The first point is the managing deep differences is a religious and existential necessity. It is not something that we can get away without or get away from. This is not something that we can do without. Differences among Muslims, including diversity of views, beliefs, and customs, cannot be eliminated and instead must be managed in the interest of Muslim unity and the flourishing of Islam. This is a whopper of a statement because many people feel that there are all kinds of reasons why this cannot happen. So this is a thesis that the rest of my statements are going to give context to, meet to, and to justify, but that's the commitment that deep differences, whether they're sectarian differences, Shia Sunni, Sufi Salafi, Hanafi Shafi'i, Ahl Hadith, not Ahl Hadith, all of this are differences that are among Muslims, and managing them rather than trying to eliminate them by eliminating the other party, managing them is necessary. Some of these differences are deep differences in that they cannot be easily resolved and command passions, such passions as to potentially ignite lasting group hatred, discord, and violence. Now, the challenge with defining deep differences is that this is a constructive enterprise, meaning that what any community considers to be deep difference is usually socially and politically constructive. And throughout history, there have been cases when Shia and Sunni coexisted. And, the major differences, for example, were between Hanafi and Shafi'i, in, for example, 4th century Nishapur, when it became an issue of violent conflicts between them that led to the demise of the city of Nishapur itself. So differences that we now see as minor could become major because they're constructed politically and socially to be so. And differences that are seen as deeper now may in fact have not been as deeply felt, or at least seen as manageable in the past. So we have to study those conditions and find ways to manage. So that's number one. Number one, the first point is managing deep differences is a necessity. Number two, the way to do that is that we must identify fundamental Islamic norms and distinguish them from our school-specific, our madhab-specific commitments, and prioritize the former over the latter. This does not mean that particular commitments that we have against another group, for instance, are not important, that we should not pursue them, that we should not try to prove ourselves right, that we should not provide critiques, but that the fact that we are Muslims, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, should trump the differences that come later. So there exist widely shared beliefs and practices essential to Islam, but monotheism, salvation, prophethood, the 5 pillars, protection of shared sacred sites of the 3 sacred sites, the mosques, and such traditions. These together constitute a shared way of life rooted in a historically extended set of sub-traditions that nevertheless converge toward an overlapping consensus. Now I'm using a Rawlsian concept here. That is, various Muslim groups, they may disagree on a number of things, but what we overlap on, it is significant both in terms of beliefs and practices. And this agreement is sufficiently robust to furnish a ground for intellectual agreement and a shared culture and civilization. So this is the second claim, that what we share is quite significant, despite the fact that we have significant differences. This shared ground facilitates coexistence and pursuit of common interests while affording ample room to disagree. An ummatic approach does not mean relativism or indifference to the truth for the sake of political unity, but a separation of high-level necessary Islamic commitments from, one might say, lower-level constructions and school-specific or parochial beliefs. So that's number 2. Number 3, Islam trumps all solidarities. For believing Muslims, our differences that are for the sake of Islam, for the sake of the religious truth, for the sake of the values of justice, of purpose of this life, and so on, they are a higher order priority, and that means that Islam trumps and regulates other solidarities, but it does not eliminate them. Some solidarities, such as bonds of family and clan and neighborhood, are in fact facilitated in Islam, except if they contradict the fundamentals of Islam. Any solidarity with the enemies of Islam, with those who are actively hostile to Islam, against the interests of the Muslim Ummah, or for the sake of any sinful ends, is prohibited by unanimously. So this is what allows Islam to be a sufficient and necessary ground to manage these differences among Muslims qua Muslims. Muslims as Muslims, if we can figure out that a way to manage these differences, it becomes possible to prioritize Islamic solidarity as a sufficient way toward a political coexistence. Point number four is facilitation of truth-seeking and truth commitment. Living the truths that we have requires accepting a measure of reciprocity among Muslims. Take the example of Mawlid. You should be able to express your opinions on the basis of those shared commitments that we have, that whether this is a practice that is valid or not, and based on truth and fact, two communities might differ, and they might continue to critique each other, but at the same time recognize that they both love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they both love the Quran, they both in fact are arguing on the basis of some very, very similar theoretical principles of legal usul, and they reach different conclusions on issues that are major, more important than this, all the time, and are able to live together. So, but there should be freedom to pursue these discourses. You should be able to even talk to each other in public forums respectably, to try to persuade each other. And then at the same time, that doesn't have anything to do with, it should not turn into violence or inability to live together. This requires embracing a measure of reciprocity among Muslims, meaning that you have to allow other Muslims the same kind of rights that you have. At the individual and communal level, Muslims then must allow each other to be free to seek and live the divine truth as they see it in their respective religious communities within the limits of broadly shared Islamic norms. And this leads me to my next point, my fifth and final point, which is that if these above four premises are granted, then it becomes necessary for Muslims to carve out a conceptual space where all Muslims can pursue their shared interests as Muslims rather than as Sunni, Shia, Sufi, Salafi, black, white, rich, poor, and so on. Parochial religious argumentation from within one sub-tradition is not the proper mechanism to manage particular intra-Muslim deep differences. So here, what I'm saying is that, as a Sunni, you will uphold certain authorities. Maybe as a Hanafi Sunni, you will uphold certain authorities, but you will not necessarily use particular Hanafi commitments to use as an argument in a shared Muslim public sphere. But you may use distinctive Hanafi reasoning to justify the existence of this public sphere. That is, Hanafis, as the Shia, the Salafis, and Hadith all can come together that such a public sphere, such a place where Muslims can live together, coexist, even give protection to non-Muslims, Zimmis. That's all of the madhahib agree on this. How can we not give protection and the rights of brotherhood to each other? So you may make particular arguments as a Hanafi or a Shafi'i or the Salafi or the Sufi to enrich this public sphere, but its basic functioning, its management cannot rely on specific commitments. In other words, you cannot say that an Islamic, if you will, government or khilafa or imara or what have you, this requires that everybody celebrate Mawlid, or nobody should ever celebrate Mawlid. These are not commitments, because these are commitments that become parochial. One of them may be right, one of them is wrong, but you accept that there is a place to make those arguments, and then shared life as Muslims doesn't depend on that. So this requires a dedicated discipline of ummatic politics and a set of institutions in order to facilitate and enforce fair rules of engagement. This is a key element of what we call Islamic politics, or ummatic politics, or ummatics for short. The Khalifa Uthman radiallahu anh famously said, "Inna Allah yaza'a bil-sultan ma la yaza'a bil-Quran." God achieves by means of political authority what he does not achieve by means of the Quran. We need political authority for such purposes. Although ultimately one of the functions of perhaps the Islamic government, once we have such a thing, as an institution to do such a thing, we have to prepare for it. And the discourses and practices of managing in deep differences must be cultivated in all Muslim communities and local governments as they exist today. So the main function of any politics, right? This is not a new idea for the realm of politics, because any politics is about the management of differences, different opinions, and different interests. And Islamic politics requires that such management among Muslims must be rooted in Islam. This requires investment in an institutional design of distribution of powers and ensuring equality and fairness and so on, which entails that public governance is grounded in the broadly agreed upon norms of the Sharia and considerations of prudence and justice and the higher aims of Islam, the maqasid of the Sharia, and the protection of the lands of Islam, our sacred sites, and endangered and oppressed Muslim populations, things that we can all agree on. This separation can be amply attested in the early Islamic governance and in classical Islamic theological and juristic thought, in siyasa shari'ah discourses. And inshallah, we have time, we can come back to what those specific discourses are. But I will, inshallah, stop here, and I'll allow you to hear Dr. Yasmin's comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Anjum, for that overview of what's an interesting set of ideas characterizing exactly the problem of deep differences and proposing a set of principles that allows us to manage those differences without eliminating them and hopefully achieve unity. And next up is Professor Daifullah, who's going to be responding to and commenting on these ideas. Professor Daifullah, you have 20 minutes, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, wonderful.
Very good. Yes.
Thank you to the Ummatics team for inviting me to engage with this very important work of Dr. Anjum's. And as you will see in the context of my remarks, they will be referring to the written document upon which this presentation is based, which I take it most of our listeners and audience today would have probably not read, but Dr. Anjum kindly gave a broad and substantive overview of what that document entails. So I will also be giving you a taste of that and perhaps whet your appetite to get to it at a later point. So off I go. So the first part of my remarks, I provide a brief recap of what I took to be the gist or the general structure of Dr. Anjum's argument about an ummatic framework for managing deep differences. And then I proceed to provide a few thoughts and questions that I had while reading the paper, as well as listening to Dr. Anjum's comments this morning. So building on a prior set of papers that provided by the Ummatics project and Ummatics platform, justifying the need and desire for ummatic governance. In this paper and presentation, Dr. Anjum attempts to chart the broad contours of what an ummatic framework for managing what he calls deep differences might look like. As we saw in the presentation, the paper begins with a set of framing propositions about the inevitability of difference in any polity, in our case it's the umma, and the necessity for developing a set of principles and institutions that could manage these differences as peacefully and justly as possible. The paper proceeds to give a sense of what these principles are. For example, the primacy of high-level Islamic commitments and beliefs in monotheism, prophethood, the 5 pillars, the necessity of protecting sacred sites, things on which the Muslim community converges, and of the freedom to believe and practice in the way one sees fit, the necessity of developing an ummatic politics that could facilitate and enforce rules of communal engagement in a way that is acceptable to all, i.e., that does not reflect an allegiance to a legal, theological, or sectarian subtradition. So these are some of the principles that Dr. Anjum proposes as the bulwark upon which a theory, an ummatic theory of difference management could be based. The paper, as in the presentation, move on then to provide us with a sense of what differences qualify as deep. Namely, it tells us, quote, those that escape easy resolution or settlement and excite such passions as to potentially cause lasting discord. It then moves on to give us an account of how these differences come into being, whether, for example, they come about from attributes of our inherent human nature, or whether they are products of history and its workings. Be that as it may, Dr. Andrum concludes that, quote, in most cases, deep differences are socially constructed, although some deep doctrinal differences might have historically been more prone to conflict than others. On the balance, then, Islamic history features examples of socioeconomic conflicts made deep through their articulation as religious conflicts made deep through their politicization, and or conflicts that deepen with the passage of time and the workings of intergenerational memory. The paper concludes by offering broad strokes of resources that can be mobilized for managing these differences from our history and tradition, including revelation, a historically sensitive reading of our legal, theological, and political tradition, as well as specific examples that Dr. Andrum draws from Sunni legal history. Okay, so my thoughts about the propositions that Dr. Andrum's paper and presentations put forward turn around two main pivots. The first concerns definitions of key terms, and the second relates to how we are to conceptualize deep differences. So now I start with my first set of thoughts that have to do with definitions. The paper provides us with preliminary but sufficiently orienting definitions of a set of key and important terms. Two of these definitions that I would like to clarify and perhaps probe a little are those of deep difference and of politics. And also, Professor Andrum kindly fleshed those out a little bit in the presentation. So I'm hoping we're also going to have a conversation about that with the audience. So with deep differences, about different differences and politics. I start with my questions about the notion of deep difference. Though I will return to the notion of deep differences later, as when we talk about how are we to see them or understand them. Here, in the definitional set of remarks, I just want to ask a clarifying question about the distinction between deep differences and conflict. The paper helpfully defines deep differences as, quote, ones that escape easy resolution or settlement and excite such passions as to potentially cause lasting discord. While scholars of the social sciences are perhaps more used to the notion of conflict, social, political, religious, as that which requires management, redress, or resolution, in choosing the alternate formulation, deep differences, this paper seems to be making a conscious definitional and conceptual move to not only address existing or historical conflicts, but perhaps to pay attention to what it presumes to be at conflict's root, the conditions that create the potential for conflict. But this gesture, this use of deep differences rather than conflict, if indeed intentional, remains implicit and its consequences not flagged or fleshed out. Indeed, at times, the paper seems to presume the equivalence of deep difference and conflicts, as when we read that, quote, recognizing the true nature and severity of conflicts and differences is necessary to their resolution. So we note here the equivalence of deep conflicts and differences. At others, however, the distinction between difference and conflict is not foregrounded or not explicit, such as when Dr. Andrum notes that there are, quote, unobjectionable kinds of difference, such as those of, quote, natural diversity, differences in fields of specialization, differences in generation, differences in culture, in gender, in region. To that unobjectionable list, the paper also adds another kind of difference whose contribution to conflict is not really clarified, such as differences of interests based on tribal, class, or status affinities, and others that are seen to be considered more conflict-prone, such as differences in beliefs or ways of seeing the world. As we could probably see from this preliminary listing of the various kinds of difference, even of difference, even the most unobjectionable kinds of difference, culture, region, natural differences of gender or race or ethnicity, if we consider these natural, have indeed been sources of historical conflict. Thus, the question remains as to what we stand to gain or lose by using the language of difference rather than that of conflict. Is the endeavor about understanding difference before they erupt into conflict? Or is the formulation deep differences meant to give standing and legitimacy, to give perhaps analytical weight to human differences, whether they're essential or constructed, before and beyond their proneness to producing conflictual situations? Now, whereas this question might seem a bit semantic, it would, I suggest, have consequences for how an ummatic theory of difference management would proceed. Would it, for example, be concerned with a deep understanding of deep differences, a scholarly endeavor par excellence? Or would it be concerned with the situation when these erupt into open conflict and require institutional management, a political mission of the first order? Moreover, conventional theories of conflict management and resolution typically presuppose a certain conception of human beings as a premise that guides the process for managing conflictual situations. These theories figure human beings, for example, as needing certain material and spiritual goods, or having particular purposes, etc. An ummatic political theory that concerns itself with conflict management would need to offer a preliminary conception of who we are as human beings, what we need, and what our purpose is. One that is sensitive enough to context, yet cogent enough to offer a view, a set of institutions and practices that would be universally acceptable to Muslim communities. So this is what my remarks on the definitional, either elision or equivalence or difference between deep differences and conflict hinges on. Okay, so that's A, under definitions. B, second. Second is my questions about the notion of politics, or how this paper and presentation understands politics. While politics is perhaps not explicitly defined in the paper, although it did come across more in the presentation, I would say, we got a sense of what it is from the other spheres to which politics is juxtaposed or opposed. In general, the domain of what is political is distinguished from that which is, quote, theological, hermeneutic, or coercive. Since the paper is concerned with delineating an ummatic politics, it conceives politics as a mode of managing difference that does not adjudicate our variation in how parties understand Islamic doctrine. How, for example, parties to a conflict would understand specific verses or hadith, or whether their affinity is to a specific theological school is considered right or wrong. And that this management should not involve the use of force. There is a presupposition here, then, that arbiters or conflict managers, say the judges, mediators in a conflict situation, are able to suspend or cast aside their own affinity to a theological school or an exegetical position. The domain of politics is understood here as both neutral and nonviolent, as solely motivated by upholding the most basic tenets of Islam, the ones enjoying the broadest possible consensus. But perhaps more specifically, the paper understands an ummatic politics as comprising a set of, quote, discourses and corresponding institutions and techniques grounded in a set of minimal, agreed upon fundamental beliefs of Islam, and as consisting of laws that concern themselves with collective needs, aspirations, and policies, and manage areas such as defense, public law and order, and collective projects. The ummatic political theory of managing deep differences, then, seems to presuppose a certain theory of state, one which is minimalist, concerned with fulfilling basic needs and guaranteeing law and order, non-coercively overseeing a social and a cultural sphere. If this is indeed the case, then this would mean that politics is almost by definition the sphere in which conflicts are mediated, managed, resolved, but not necessarily generated. These differences form, ferment, and deepen outside the domain of the state, and the latter's regulatory functions would seem to only kick in when things go awry, and to do so in a capacious, value neutral, i.e., political terms, according to the way the way I understand the paper's formulation of politics. While I see the merits of defining politics in this delimited fashion, I think that it runs two risks. First, the risk of being unrealistic or impractical. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the risk of foregoing the potential rewards of defining politics more expansively. What would happen, for example, if we expanded our understanding of ummatic politics to include other domains, perhaps those of what we refer to by civil society, norms cultivating, community building, subject forming institutions and practices? Now, we know from studies in politics, sociology, anthropology, that this is indeed how politics operates in everyday life, and that critiques of liberal understandings of politics that presuppose a neutral state adjudicating conflict using an overlapping consensus are problematic precisely because they fail to take that expansive understanding of politics seriously. What happens to our ummatic political theory of state or of difference if we do? What kinds of institutions and players would we need to build in that case? What kinds of actors would we need to train and cultivate if politics was seen as the practice of everyday life, rather than the realm of Sharia guided arbitration by high minded arbiters, for example? To open up, to redefine politics as a realm that entails more than the procedural, the regulatory, and the normative, and as featuring the formation of dispositions towards oneself and others, and between collectives, perhaps the notion of urf comes closer to that meaning, brings me to my second and final set of questions. Here, I am concerned less with how we define pivotal terms like difference or politics, and more with how we understand the nature and character of deep differences, and therefore how we could best develop an approach towards managing. Okay, so I move to my second and final set of questions, which I call conceptual questions about deep differences. The paper starts by indicating rightly, in my estimate, that interpersonal and intergroup differences cannot be eliminated and must instead be managed. Indeed, Muslims are familiar with the idea that the differences that shape our collective life from its most basic unit, the family, to its most expansive one, the nations, is of divine origin. As with the Hujurat verse, O you people, we created you from a male and a female, we made you into nations and tribes, so that you may come to know one another. But the point, of course, is not that we are different per se, but that our differences have and will generate contention. Helpfully, the paper also reminds us, or the presentation also reminds us, that while some of these differences may be considered essential, others, including the transmutation or transformation of essential units like families and nations through time, are constructed. That is, differences are made into age-old, seemingly insurmountable barriers between us through the workings of politics and history, rather than through our inherent natures. The question I want to raise here is, what happens if we shift our attention from the nature of differences, whether they are essential, constructed, or a blend of both, to their effects? To turn our attention in that direction, I suggest, is to try and examine what transforms differences into deep differences. To explain what I mean here, let me return to my earlier point about defining politics. For it is perhaps helpful to recall here that what turns differences into contentions and contentions into long-lasting injustices, and these into experiences of deep fissure is imbalances of power. What deepens differences, in other words, is a combination of difference, essential or constructed, that are prolonged and systematic, so as to produce deep and enduring harm, physical harm, economic harm, extraction and exploitation, social harm, for example, the destruction of social fabrics in wars, refugees, etc. Psychological harm, such as intergenerational trauma, grievance, rage, depression, etc. Or, as intersectional scholarship teaches us, a blend of some or all of these kinds of harms. The point I'm making here is that differences are often not deepened by virtue of mere distinctions of belief, of opinion, of interest, gender, nation, social class, or station, race, etc. Rather, these differences become animated or are put into motion as vectors of conflict in a social field when they are associated with questions of power, how it is distributed, wielded, and allocated. And this is, I think, what politics really teaches us. It would seem to follow that to address deep differences is therefore to address both the palpable effects of deep differences amongst Muslims and the kind of institutional arrangements that could address and redress these effects, such as, say, reparations, truth and conciliation, substantive redistribution of wealth and political power, etc. Though the paper admits that what makes differences deep is their intimate connection to the passions, i.e., the relationship to deep-seated experiences of harm, it mostly proceeds as though these differences could be mitigated, mediated, and perhaps even resolved by primarily rational and intellectual means, by, for example, recalling our shared Islamic norms, or emphasizing our belief in monotheism, salvations, prophethood, etc., that could furnish grounds for intellectual agreement and the shared culture and civilization, I quote, while providing room for disagreement. Note here that disagreement, here as elsewhere in the presentation, are concerned with matters of belief or between Muslims, differences in legal, theological, or sectarian schools. Differences which the paper correctly points out we could tackle by instituting a greater freedom of discourse and a differentiation of disciplines and honoring contract-based legal rights. What that leaves out of the picture, however, is two questions, and I conclude here. The question of what makes differences deep in the first place, what transforms them, from facts of life to passion exciting and therefore potentially destructive forces. Here I suggest what we need is not only a sense of how to manage difference of belief or doctrine, and more how to manage inequalities and consequent injustices of power. Examinations of the intertwinement of difference and power, economic, political, social, discursive, in recent Muslim history would be in order here. Second, if we take seriously the role that history and power play in creating complex and not only deep differences, what I mean by complex is differences experienced as social, economic, and cultural and emotional grievance, multi-layered difference. What can we do to address and redress the differences that exist among the Ummah today in a manner that would account for the various registers of harm or deep and complex difference? To take these questions seriously is to conceive an ummatic political theory that takes stock of the multiple dimensions of who we are as modern or post-colonial, or however we want to call ourselves, human beings, of who we are as human beings and as human collectives, and of the state of the Ummah in the here and now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those, wonderful comments and for the initial presentation, both of you, Professor Zanjum, Professor Zaifullah. And now I have the challenge of, kind of summarizing, the conversation, which was, I took extensive notes. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do this. I have like 5 pages of notes, but let me try. And I think I'm going to start with Professor Dayfullah's to kind of summarize, the the potential challenges with the ummatic framework that Professor Anjum set out, and I'll take the last point first. I think from what I take, I think Professor Dayfullah seems to be saying, "Hey, listen, maybe what is the most important factor in generating differences that become deep and then that eventually lead to, conflict that is endemic, unbridgeable, unsolvable, that causes a lot of harm between individuals and communities, is not just or the necessarily, sectarian, theological, legal, intellectual differences, but actually it stems from unequal distributions of power, unequal access to power, maybe, which can be reduced to access to wealth, and that in fact an ummatic theory of politics and an ummatic theory of managing differences need to focus on and have a response to, well, I mean, what is the role of unequal differences in power in generating this set of deep differences that could, that could or will inevitably turn into conflict? And when you make this point, Professor Dayfullah, I think you seem to be kind of, really focusing in on a point that Professor Anjum makes, which is that oftentimes, seemingly minor differences become major and become sources of conflict because of particular socio-political, economic consequences, conditions, and that's the reason why the process of turning a difference into something that becomes a deep difference and a source of conflict is what Professor Anjum called socially or politically constructed. So that's kind of like the one of the main points that you bring up, and maybe Professor Anjum, you can respond to that. The other thing I think that Professor Dayfullah, you seem to be saying is that you say, okay, so there's deep difference and there's conflict, and there is a distinction between the two. If we say that um, conflict, the management of conflict, and let's define conflict as something that emerges into physical harm between groups, or really intense competition between them, not just a matter of having intellectual or theological differences that don't you know transcend that barrier and emerge into conflict. Like if conflict is the central problem, then the idea of how you would respond to that problem is going to be, how do you manage it at an institutional level? How do you design political institutions that help manage that conflict, resolve that conflict, and what are the practices that can help you do that? But if um, we're talking about something that is prior to conflict, if deep difference is um, maybe a category that is broader than or antecedent to conflict, and that's going to be the central problem for managing difference, not conflict, then we have to have a more robust account of what is an Islamic or ummatic conception of human nature and human destiny, and something like that is kind of what I'm taking you to be saying is at stake in this. So this is kind of my understanding of Professor Dayfullah's commentary on Professor Anjum's paper, and I think that there's a lot of questions that have emerged as well in the chat. But let's, Professor Anjum, do you kind of want to respond to some of these issues, and then we can look at some of the questions that emerged in the chat.
Okay, I will do so, inshallah. Try to be brief. There is so much here. So first of all, this is like the best response I could have gotten. It really allows me to think deeply and seriously about the propositions I've made. And it certainly, it's one of those cases where the response actually does a much better theorization than my initial proposal. And so I don't mean to respond in the sense that I can neutralize the challenges, the critiques and thought, but more like how can I engage in those. So here is how I think of it. First of all, the question of deep differences and why do we start at the level of differences rather than level of conflicts? I think it's a really, really important question. And honestly, I didn't think enough about it. Although in my initial paper, I do distinguish between different ways of thinking of sectarianism and differences. And, there is an essentialist school of definitions, and then what I call a constructivist school of understanding this, that these are constructed differences. And I'm very much on the constructivist side. But that said, why do I then why am I invested in differences, and why not just go to conflict? Because I admit that you could take a minor issue, a minor difference. It could be a shade of color in your skin. It could be, it could be a sports team in which which side you are on. That can become a source of conflict. And so, is there a reason for us to think about differences first? And my answer to that is, and I guess let me also connect that to the other critique that you make, which I think is really, really important, and I need to think about more, is I seem to have this liberal theorist bias of focusing on politics as in this constitutional realm of fundamental truths, fundamental principles that we can all agree on, and then real politics in which there is inequality, in which there is history of injustice and trauma, and all of that is set aside. I think that that's the part where I think our most productive discussion can happen, and I want to, inshallah, take that on. I need to think a lot more. But basically, my hope is, and my proposition is, that constitutional politics is different from day-to-day quotidian politics, meaning that when communities are with the community of politics, that is in the modern nation state system, it's taken for granted, which is why I think that modern sort of a lot of discussions of politics do not ask that question, but it's just because it takes a certain question for granted, a certain assumption for granted, which is that the national community is the community. And then, yes, you can diversify the national community, but the borders are what define the community. But I'm trying to, I think, in asking about differences, I'm trying to address a question that I think is more fundamental. It's a fundamental challenge to the nation state, which is that what are the differences that matter and what are the differences that don't matter, so that the differences that don't matter constitute a political community. And differences that matter, right? That differences like, for instance, between Muslims and non-Muslims, then those are dealt with in the Islamic tradition through other institutions. And that I take that as an example of how Islamic law gives legal personality to non-Muslims certain rights, but the community that is first constituted, that then that gives rights to the non-Muslim protected legal communities, or the zimmis, is that umma that has to be first constituted. And if the ummah cannot be constituted because of those differences, then the very first act of political thinking and political construction cannot be done. So I'm interested in that, which is not to say that the actual politics is somehow not important, or that it could be somehow neglected in favor of constitutional theorization. In other words, so I think that when it comes to the question of power, for example, I would say that how do you define inequality and power and injustice? It's not possible to define that without knowing first that there is a basis for equality and shared values. And only when that community has been established, then you can, then talk about why these inequalities are unjust and cannot be taken for granted. So I would say something to think in that direction, right? And then on the question of, I think that that's really our major point where I want to talk to you more and read your paper more carefully. But I agree with everything that you said, including where there's just lack of clarity in what I say. So I'll leave it there, inshallah, and love to hear your thoughts, Professor Miraj, your thoughts, and our readers and audience's questions.
So I want to pursue these grand, theoretical discussions further. But before we do that, I think there is an important comment that's being made, or a question that's being made, that kind of maybe brings us back down to earth a little bit. And this is there's a question that I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to give my interpretation of the question.
Okay.
This concept of ummatics is great in managing intra-Muslim differences and promote more unity amongst our institutions. But what institutions is this directed to? Nations, governments? So that's the question. And I think it's kind of hinting to something broader, which is, who is the audience? So, I mean, who is the audience of this paper? Like, who are supposed to live by these five, ideals that you kind of outline for managing deep differences? Is it at the individual level? Is it at the level of, the particular religious community or movement that I belong to, if it's Muslim? Is it directed to, okay, we're imagining an ummah that has come into being, and this ummah is expressed in a robust political way, right? And how does that ummah then manage its differences? Or is it directed towards even the international community? Like, what is the audience? And I think this kind of goes back to like, what is an individual Muslim supposed to do with political theory or an ummatic political theory? And especially this latter part, I'd like to hear not just Professor Anjum, but also, Professor Zayfullah as well. Like, so, please.
So, I mean, that's a great question, because I think that I have a very positive valuation of politics as an enterprise. I think of politics in a particular way, in a particular definition, which I think is Dr. Zayfullah is absolutely right to point out that I'm taking certain things for granted. That politics is there to manage differences, but also is like a certain fundamental assumption about politics being one that basically I'm defining politics against something. And what is that something? You could say that it is the politics is the idea that there is a collectivity, and then we can work together, we can live together, and then we share resources. But there is such a thing as we, and that we is somehow defined and known, and that it is important to define that if you don't define that, if you don't have a community, you cannot have all of the benefits of shared, of actions, political actions that we often take for granted. So, for example, one example I like to give my students is that you could think of a village, for example, where there may be, there are different types of people. People share resources. There are village elders. There is resources that are sometimes tight, sometimes not, and there are norms. Sometimes there are punishments applied, and so on. But what makes this politics rather than what makes this good politics rather than simply self-interested action in maximizing personal benefit is when people can imagine that there is such a thing as this is good for the whole village. This is good for the whole community, that I'm going to do this, and my altruistic action, my sense of identity is connected to this larger group. And it's only this possibility that allows us to act what we may call altruistically, because my definition of myself has somehow extended to include this larger community. A gas station, on the other hand, is not a community, even though there are a lot of people that live there. They're exchanging goods. They're they're coming in and leaving, but they don't necessarily have a sense that I want what is good for this temporary place that I'm stopping at, getting some gas, going to the bathroom and leaving. I don't have any sense of loyalty to this place. It could end and go away, and I will go to the next gas station. So the sense of who is we, I think that's what I'm saying is the first act of politics, and that's what allows us to act altruistically.
So let me. I'm gonna interrupt a little bit. So is what you're saying. I mean, I don't want to reduce a very complicated piece down to like a soundbite, but if I may try, you kind of are encouraging Muslims to think of who constitutes the relevant we as not just my legal school, my sectarian affiliation, the particular Islamic movement or theological group that I belong to, right? But as something much more broad, that and a very important we, especially when it comes to politics, is the we of the two shahadas.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of like what you're saying. So if you can respond, and then I want to ask Professor Dayfullah a question as well.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that even though all Muslims, and I guess one other thing that Professor Dayfullah points out correctly is that I'm privileging learned Muslim scholars who would engage on the basis of scripture or on the basis of some kind of discourse, rather than people who are, either those who are in real life suffering injustice or meting out injustice. I'm saying somehow that it is those people that are more important, at least to begin with. I'm not at all saying that the rest of the people are not important, but I'm saying, and this itself is an act, right? It's an act, a choice, that it is these people who are engaging with revelation in a systematic way, no matter, their differences, they first have to be figured out and principles based on that. Because if they don't have that, then we cannot have Islamic politics, ummatic politics. We could have other politics, secular politics. And I'm trying to constitute a justification for ummatic politics by saying that I will privilege this kind of thinking, even though I recognize that it is often the case that when religious people disagree, they sublimate their interests to other, to religion, when the real differences may be, based on personal interests or group interests. But until you have those fundamental principles of why this should not be done, that act of sublimation cannot be measured as being questionable, against something. So it's that something. It's what's the fundamental that we should that I'm basically trying to establish that baseline with learned people. Now, I recognize fully that it's a valid criticism of my piece to say that ordinary people do not construct their lives according to theological principles and precepts, and that in real life, it's often national differences, ethnic differences, often very much constructed based on completely arbitrary boundaries, or sometimes mythology that is passed on from ancestors. Those are things that really push a lot people a lot more than what is found in scripture and rational discourse. I think that is correct.
So let me kind of summarize what you said, and then I want to, direct a question to Professor Dayfullah. So you're kind of saying, look, it's true. Ethnic differences, racial differences, class differences, economic differences oftentimes are sublimated, articulated in a religious language, right? But and really, what might really be driving the difference or conflict are these other things. They're articulated in a religious language, especially in the Muslim Ummah. But the first step to redress and getting a handle on that is actually to talk about the particular religious, theological language in which those differences are articulated in the first place. You have to get that. You have to get a coherent grip on that, and the people that are kind of some extent the most important are the Muslim scholars, the ulama, the religious, the intellectuals, the Muslim intellectuals, are our thinkers and our graduate students, right, who are devoting systematic attention to understanding the coherence of this religious Islamic language. So that's kind of what you're saying. So in that sense, the first audience are these people.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads me to a question for Professor Zayfullah. So you are a political theorist, right? And you have an interest in articulating a vision of ummatic politics. Who is the audience of your scholarly writings, your interpretive writings, the field of an ummatic political theory? Is it, is it graduate students? Is it other scholars? Is it policymakers? Is it government bureaucrats? What about the regular, Abdullah, Aisha, Muslim that's, just living their life? Like, who is the audience of that?
Thank you very much. Well, I can't claim that I am in the business of crafting an ummatic political theory yet, so I have to just put that out there as a caveat. But if I were to engage in it, which I hope I will in due course, I think just given my own inclinations and sensibilities, I would be more inclined to understanding what's going on. It's just, again, this is a sensible, and I think just to take it back to Dr. Andrum's comments, it is important to have a division of labor. I think in the scholarly community and also in the community at large, just like in any business. So, and I don't mean business here in the corporate sense of the term, but I mean in terms of in any endeavor, human endeavor. And that's why perhaps the remarks I had were trying to perhaps pull or nudge the propositions that Dr. Andrum elegantly laid out towards in the direction of taking extant ummatic differences or conflicts, or however we want to call them, as they are, and starting there. With the thought that if we start there, if we get the sense of the nature of the beast in the here and now, and that's why I don't want to dwell so much perhaps on, for example, the technicalities or specifics of of differences in madhabs by reading the tomes of Hanafi and Shafi'i, although this is of course important, but in terms of how these become motivations of actual real life felt discord, that starting there would give us ideas about how to proceed. Now, so that's my sensibility. However, that said, I also take the point, uh, take it well, about this question of founding, which I think is maybe Dr. Anjum's remarks hint around, which is, and to my mind, it's the cart or the horse. Do we have a framework first, like like he mentioned that there's a community that is identifiable, or that we can form by identifying? For example, he notes about overlapping consensus or shared norms, what binds us rather than what drives us apart, as well as, and then using that to push for the establishment of an actual, however minimalist, however bare bones, however skeletal body of people, maybe decision makers, thought slash political leaders, to the extent that we can do that. Do we do that first, and then start thinking about, okay, what are the problems we really have, and let's then modify our workings to reflect them? Or do we start from, what are the problem, the sensibility that I try to relay, which is, what is it, what harms are there, and how are they experienced as such, and how are they related to questions of politics as power, not politics as procedures and institutions? Then establish a framework. I don't see these as mutually exclusive, but I see them as distinct approaches. Which one to take, I cannot adjudicate. I just really can't. Partially because I'm just like a professional student. And I think there is a way in which the people whose judgment we could rely upon, or at least get more of in that respect, are the people whose feet are on the ground. The people who are embroiled in conflict management on a day-to-day basis. Maybe they're imams in our masjids, that kind of thing. And how do they see this, and how do their hands are on the pulse, and what do we make of that? These are very preliminary and scattered thoughts, but yeah.
Okay.
If I may, Miraj, if you allow me to engage with that, because I want to say that this really is, I've been thinking about it for several months, if not a couple of years now, and this is this engagement and Dr. Dayfullah's question challenge is really one of the most productive engagements for me, and inshallah, I think that that will lead to hopefully overcoming some of the challenges I had in my head, like of what am I doing, what am I not saying, what am I not doing right. So I think that's really I just want to say that it is truly valuable for me to do so, to try to respond to you, and I want to say precisely from that angle that you just mentioned, which is on the ground. You see, it is from that perspective that, believe it or not, I start, because here's a very odd thing. If you talk to ordinary people, you can tell them to look, your real problems, the reason why Iranians and Saudis can't get together is because of political and social and historical. They would not know what you're talking about. If, on the other hand, you tell them that, look, the ulama of Islam, that because ordinary people are connected to particular narrative structures, and until you can address those narratives, they don't give themselves the permission to humanize each other. So I have seen this happen over and over in my own life. In fact, believe it or not, yesterday and Friday khutbah I gave was on Muslim unity and on these points that were very tough. And it's a community that's somewhat conservative Sunni community and sees these things. In fact, the khutbah was about Mawlid al-Nabi, salam. And for me to just come out and say that these are two opinions, and then go on to say that even when it comes to Sunni and Shia, look, this is what the scholarship says. It was something that for most people like holding their breath. How could I talk about this? And then there was a sense of relief, like that somebody said it out. You know, because in the context of Gaza, we're all feeling that these narratives that people have constructed, they were so false and so divisive, but nobody can come out and say that. So people are sort of have one ways to go more and more into conspiracy theories about how Iran, in reality, it's the real ally of Israel, and all of these Sunnis are in fact the ones that are just poor Muslim Sunni ruling families that are suffering at the hands of these Shia. And I'm sure there are plenty of other narratives on the Shia side as well that are just as questionable. But my point is that when you can say these principles, and you can give examples of great Muslim authorities. So, for example, on the issue of Mawlid, when I read the opinion of Ibn Hajar, I read the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah, and all of a sudden people are like able to say, okay, this is not an issue where you have to, take out your best guns and go out and defend the deen by going one way or the other, but you can actually recognize that, okay, these are limits everybody recognizes, and if people do go overstep those limits, there's arguments that are given for Mawlid, for instance, or against Mawlid that are in some ways just as good as the arguments that are given for whether we do Raf'ul Yadayn, like raise our hands while praying, or not. And we tolerate that. Why not tolerate this? And yes, there are some issues that are really passionate. People are really impassioned about, and good reason. My point is that by creating a narrative, a possibility that in fact it is within the authorities, within the sources, within our principles, that one can deal with that. I think that strangely enough, that helps the ordinary people more. And it's often the smart people who are studying and are like, oh, the Saudi Iranian crisis may not just be about Shia Sunni. It's really about other things. It's about the interests of particular groups, and it's about politics and economy and whatnot. But those people are in the minority. And
so I see Professor Daifullah nodding in agreement. So I want you to to kind of respond. But before you respond, I also want to put an audience question on the table, which I think is a good one. I mean, I think in our community we're very good at identifying problems, and we're very good at identifying who is doing a bad job. And one of our audience members has asked a very good question, which is, what are some good contemporary examples of managing intra-Muslim differences? Like, who's actually doing a good job? Which community is doing a good job? Which nation state is doing a good job? Which scholar is exemplifying? Yeah, this is actually a way that an ideal that we can aspire to. But Yasmin, before I go there, before we take the discussion in that direction. What do you think about Dr. Anjum's responses?
Yes, you saw me nodding vehemently for good reason, and perhaps it's exactly Dr. Anjum's invocation of his ethnographically driven drive for those comments, which are making sense to me more and more about how creating this, engaging in those questions, which might strike someone, for example, again, a professional student or scholar like me as, are these the real reasons people are fighting? That creates this mental and almost psychological space for people to even consider thinking otherwise. That point I take very well, and the follow-up thought rather than question that it brought to mind is one about multiple audiences and multiple objectives. So if, for example, this paper / presentation was pitched to an audience that needs to realize, the pluralism and therefore the convergence, or if that makes sense, of Muslims, then it is meant for a particular purpose and audience, and could be then translated in or vernacular, into a vernacular that can be used in khutbahs and civil society, maybe awareness raising or something like that. But then there is this other register, which I would think is the one important for politicians, when they are not doing the business of rhetoric, i.e., when they're not doing the business of, changing the minds of their populations or something like that, or persuasion, let's put it that way. When they're not in the business of persuasion, but when they are in the business of understanding the actual ways conflicts develop. And that would be a different endeavor altogether, that will not then have those presuppositions about the capaciousness of our legal or theological history or political practice, but would zoom more about the historical construction of modern day Muslim grievance, and how it works and why it's there, that are not only, and probably not most significantly driven by Sunni Shia differences or stuff like that. So these are two different registers, and will have to be, I think, not directed, pitched at certain levels, starting from the scholarly to the more vernacular, and work on very different planes of thought. I'll stop here.
Okay. I mean, I feel, interestingly, a developing sense of convergence. But before I articulate that, let's consider the question of, all right, who are good people, good communities? Like, what are good examples? What are positive examples of managing deep differences well? Do any come to mind?
So I think that there are a number of examples. Throughout history, in fact, I went through all the examples of coexistence of Shia and Sunni and various madhahib, and then I gave few exceptions when that didn't happen. In just to impress upon people this idea that, look, there have been both this and that, and in a sense we have a choice, because our history is much more interesting than they're always betraying us. These guys are always doing that, right? Once you can say, so for example, the Hanafis and Shafi'is really fought for centuries, passionately. And being actually Shia Sunni difference wasn't as important in a place like Nishapur or in Baghdad even often as it was between Ash'ari and Hanbali, or between Shia Sunni and Hanafi, Shafi'i. And so once you realize that, look, there was a time when people really did almost did takfir of each other, burned each other's books, and now they're best friends, that allows you, sort of, you could create a narrative. It becomes easier. But when you say this has always been one way or the other, that closes the possibility, because it leans toward essentialism. So, for example, I gave examples of how, when it comes to Shia Sunni, coexistence. In the Abbasid period, the dynasty that did the jihad against Byzantine aggression, the Hamdanids, were 12 Shia that are doing it on behalf of, if you will, a Sunni Khilafah. In the case of the Crusades, for example, it is often said that the Fatimids were 7 Shia who sort of collaborated with the Crusaders, and it's true in part. But at the same time, the very first jihad, the first resistance that began in Aleppo, actually, by some 20 years after the Crusades, was by this vizier named Ibn al-Khashab, who tries to recruit his, his commander, his governor, to fight, to resist. When he doesn't do that, he goes to Baghdad and asks the Sunni Khalifa to do so, and that doesn't happen. Nothing comes of that. So he himself becomes the leader, an alim, a qadi, who leads the army. And in fact, it's the first defeat of the Crusaders. I mean, there's small incidents often forgotten. Now, this vizier is Ibn al-Khashab, who's a 12er Shia. Now, often what people remember is, on the Sunni side, is the cases when the Shia did wrong, which is very much a psychological challenge we have, right? We always remember those incidents that confirm the narratives that we have. And so a good historical knowledge, fair historical knowledge, it allows you to do that. And so precisely those examples when Muslims, in fact, could collaborate, those are very important. What they are, I think that in the West, there's an opportunity in the United States, in the West in particular, in the US and Canada, where there are a number of initiatives where Muslims, Sunni and Salafi, Shia, Sufi and Salafi have come together, Shia and Sunni have come together to give collective statements, to do events together. I think that is terrific. Another example is in Britain, which is a very, very charged place. Sheikh Haytham al-Haddad, a very well-known and important Salafi sheikh, has in fact gone around and gathered all the various Muslim Sunnis and come together and made a collective statement where this is what we all agree on. And I know that he wants to go further, but it's hard right now. I think it's easier to do so in the United States. But that's an example. And what they were telling us, and I think I do see that myself, is that the UK, London, is a different place now than it was 20 years ago. It was constantly Sufi Salafi mutual bashing and other things that are, and I'm just picking those examples. There are of course many other axes of difference, but that's it's much more common now to have scholars and individuals from both communities participate in the same events and give statements supporting each other, have dialogue. I think that's terrific. I think that another example I want to give is in Tahrir Square. It was a time of great hope and optimism when Christians and Salafis were getting together, and others who were, secularists and Islamists were playing soccer together and having coffee together. Like there was a sense that we are, when I say secularists in Egypt, of course, is a different connotation than, say, in the West, where it's a much stronger term. But people are, when they feel that they are empowered, when they feel that they can, then they're able to overcome these differences. But that narratives have to be there, right? Because that narrative, the ideas have to be there that are then implemented. There has been, for example, an institution called Taqrib al-Madahib in Egypt, in Al-Azhar, and in Egypt there was an office for a while. I don't know if there is in Tehran. There is an office between Shia and Sunni, where scholars on both sides actually have been working on it. And there is an annual conference, believe it or not, in Tehran on this between Taqrib al-Madahib. Dr. Muhammad Salim al-Awa, a well-known Egyptian intellectual and Islamic scholar, has written about this significantly. So basically that discourse exists in the ether, and then an opportunity comes up or a crack comes up and people take it up. Now, none of this to mean that actual differences are not important. I'm simply saying that prioritizing them is what's necessary. So if you can agree that we all believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, then you can have I want to say one final thing, that why these kind of propaganda is really, really harmful. I teach at the university here, and I have many students, and Saudi students, remember, came to me and said they're Shia Saudi. And I remember what they were telling me is that they are actually open to learning what Sunnis say, open to learning history, but they say that other Sunni Saudis sometimes think that we're not even fully human, that there are stories about how we have tails inside of our thawb. Like this kind of misinformation, which is really dehumanizes the other people. And I'm sure there's plenty, and I know there's plenty on the other side as well. But because I'm Sunni, I want to emphasize the points that I see in the Sunni community. So all this to say that they're good examples of both.
Okay. Professor Daifullah, you have anything to add on this question? Or let me make the question a little bit broader, and then I noticed a couple of very interesting questions popped up. So I would be interested to hear from you. Like, okay, you're kind of saying, look, a couple of things, if I can reduce them. One is ground up. What are the real problems? We have to kind of pay attention to what real human beings, individual human beings, going through their lives, negotiating life, negotiating conflict, negotiating harm and injustice. That's where we should start from when we want to, talk about difference and conflict and harm. That's one thing that you're saying, and the other thing that you're saying, which now I've lost. The other thing that you're saying is that really at the root, the core problem seems to be power imbalance and the distribution of power in society, the unbalanced distribution of power in society. Like, what are certain examples, whether historical or contemporary, of political communities, Muslim or non-Muslim, that have done a good job of both gathering information about what is actually affecting people, and also, developing a system, an institutional framework that does try to redress the power imbalances? Because do any come to mind?
I mean, I'm not a scholar of these things, but maybe when in the context of my presentation, I try to take my memory for some of these examples, not so much holistic, as in they solve the problems, but there were some institutional setups to address certain situations. For example, post-apartheid South Africa comes to mind. What kind of
the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Truth and Reconciliation. I think they had similar one in Morocco, also after the years of lead, 30 years of political repression. Of course, that's not to say these are effective 100%, but how did they work? I mean, they are worth consideration. To what extent, what were their failings? What were their successes? If we think about the failings and or maybe successes of addressing the racial question in North America, say, or other parts of the world, in terms of racial injustice in the United States as a model, what has been done or not done? in that.
Something like
Mhm.
post Civil War Reconstruction or the Civil Rights Movement,
Exactly.
fighting segregation. These would be potential models that we can look at.
Ex-
Something like
and
that.
on the legal level, yes. So what the examples you're mentioning, but also I think we would do well to engage with civil rights, civil society initiatives or organizations that are working on the ground with racial minorities, say, and especially with long histories of harm, uh, this multi or complex kind of harm that I try to pitch a little bit in my remarks. And how do they understand and work with that on a more grounds up level, and how can that inform our understanding of our situation? I think Professor Androm gave a very good set of made the case for how, when we, and I see it coming up in the questions as well, of how when we have examples of coexistence or however we want to call it, tolerance, coexistence, etc., from our history, this really helps pitch it as doable and unsettles our understandings of the age-old uh, resentments and differences. And I think this is the work of history. And I think to complementing that would be the work of something like anthropology or sociology to give us examples of how is this being done now in the here and now and every day. I'm sure each of us has anecdotal evidence from friends. I have, for example, Iraqi friends who talk about coexistence in Iraq not very long ago, say 30 or 40 years ago, that this was a real thing in big Iraqi urban centers. How did that happen? What were the conditions for its production? Was it only limited to certain groups, say class groups, educational groups, but not others? And why? Uh, so studying a more maybe recent past, or maybe the present to the extent that we can, um, would also, I think, complement that historical, theological, legal, etc., knowledge of how Muslims did it in the past, and because I trust that Muslims are still doing it in the present. It's just not as advertised or sensationalized as conflicts are, because conflicts are in the habit and the business of that, but also especially with Islamophobia and whatnot. But also conflicts result in real problems, and we tend to hear about problems rather than the reverse.
So I want to change the topic because our audience is demanding attention. But before I do that, I'm going to give the audience members an assignment. Whoever is paying, watching the live stream right now, because I'm a professor, I love giving assignments and homework. So the assignment for our audience members, if you're still paying attention, is, we've heard a lot about, all right, at the communal everyday level, what are the conflicts that are present in your communities? What are the deep differences? It would be interesting to hear, like, what's actually going on, maybe that hasn't been covered in this colloquium so far. So if you can do that, that would be wonderful. So that's your homework assignment. And then the homework assignment for Professors Daifullah and Anjum are a couple of questions that came up. And I think they're great questions. And as Professor Anjum was giving his initial remarks, I was thinking about this. And the questions have to do with, look, it seems like Muslim intellectual history, Islamic intellectual history has done a pretty good job of managing legal differences between the schools, right? One question says awareness and acceptance of difference in fiqh is mainstream. So why do you think this is not the case for aqidah and theology? And similarly, so why is aqidah, why is theology, why is kalam so intractable and results in mutual takfiring back and forth, when in law things are a lot more calm? Like, do you any thoughts on this, Professor Anjum?
Yeah, so I want to echo the point Dr. Daifullah made, which is that history is doing a lot of work in what we are saying here. And I think that is, the question is also pertaining to history. Like, it's an assumption that is the case. But this is also constructed. Now, there may be some essential difference between mere practice and belief, right? And in Islam, belief is more important than practice, only to a certain degree. Otherwise, belief and practices are quite tightly coupled. But the difference or the animosity between Ahlul Ra'yi and Ahlul Athar, between Medina and Iraq, was quite strong at one time. And they didn't see the differences between, law or theology or whatnot, but these were the use of opinion, use of Ra'yi versus, versus not, versus sticking to the opinion, the inherited opinions of earlier generation. And this at one point generated great energy and heat until it was resolved. And often, it's often said, the story almost cartoonish, but there is some truth to it, that in Iraq you have Ahlul Ra'yi, Medina you have Ahlul Athar, and Malik is a champion of Medina, Abu Hanifa is a champion of Iraq, and then comes Shafi'i, who sort of creates or articulates the unwritten assumptions of both schools and makes usul al-fiqh possible, in which a language becomes possible in which it's possible for both sides to communicate and put their preferences, their legal method, into one framework. And that's what usul al-fiqh does. It provides a language for these different people to talk the same, same language and to be able to communicate. But on the question of theology, it is true that it's more sensitive, but it is also, you can find many examples when theological issues are relatively minor, and it's a practice that was where the difference is really felt in common life, in ordinary life. Even if you think about Shia and Sunni, it is certain very felt differences between whether honoring of the Sahaba or betraying of the family of the Prophet, alayhi salam. Those are very practical things. They're not theoretical things. There are certain narratives constructed around those very practical things. So I think that theology, Shia theology and Sunni theology, when it comes to kalam, are actually both post-date the formation of the community by centuries. And obviously, this is a statement or a thesis in intellectual history. But I think that there is a need. I recognize that theological or deeply felt intellectual ideational differences are seen as more deeply constructive of our identity than our practices in Islam. And I'm not going to challenge. I could challenge that by giving other examples, but the point is, I'll take it as it is. This has been historical reality, despite many, many exceptions. I will say that there is a need to draw from the better examples of in our tradition and come up with a similar kind of ecumenism as existed among the mazahib, because there was a time, and I gave some examples, I give many more, when Hanafis and Shafi'is would physically engage in violence. Like there were actual battles. Now, of course, in reality, you could say those battles were about something else. And that's almost always the case. But I think that the intellectual work that needs to be done is to argue what are the ways in which a kind of theological ecumenism can be built up. And one final point I want to make is that this is important work. I think that Professor Daifallah, you're asking us to think about real reasons for differences and for grievances and for traumas that are often grounded in material realities of inequality, of previous injustices, wars, and so on. But we are also, as Muslims, we are creatures of belief. We are creatures of iman. And human beings, Islam begins with an idea, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, that transforms, right? The Prophet ﷺ does not go and say, well, you've got this merchant class oppressing these property-less people, right? He starts with, so there is human beings at a more fundamental level than material possession and material connections. We are souls. And as such, it's important in a very theological and deep and intimate way for Muslims to be at peace with that, with a political move, with the polity and the brotherhood and sisterhood, al-wala and bara. These are all discussions in Islamic aqidah, precisely because that solidarity is necessary to being a Muslim, and it's connected to iman, and therefore it is important to talk about ideas, the questions of truth, which is what theology is concerned with, or the question of right practice, which is what law is concerned with. So I think that all I'm saying is that for Muslims, the problems cannot be reduced to their material manifestations. And can I also just echo the comment that came in? I really like that. I think is it Hakim or Hakim, that we lack intellectual safe spaces to really engage in critical examination of many views. There are just no safe spaces. I'll tell you stories after stories of what allowed me to engage with Sufis and Salafis and Shia and other people I disagree with in academic conferences or many other spaces that are not made available in Muslim spaces, but because I live in a non-Muslim country. And that has allowed me to challenge some of the assumptions that most people who are not in the who are not in the academy, who live their life of ordinary Muslim wouldn't have. So, a story I often tell is that when I would go to academic conferences as a graduate student, I remember it was, there would be dozens of Muslim students or Muslim-sounding students who maybe even talking about some Muslim topics of this or that text and whatnot, and whether Mesa or AAR, but often it was me and my one or two Shia friends who were looking for a place to pray when it's time to pray. And so the idea that, often many Sunnis have, that the Shia are not really believers, so they don't really feel this, or somehow it's all their belief is not genuine. I know that for a fact, very intimately, that's false. That's not possible except if you have in that space where you have exchanged belief, when you had exchanged ideas and when you have sort of stood together against this sea of skeptics and non-believers, and made your point. So, yeah.
Couple of points, and then I have a reflection that I want to hear both of your thoughts on, and then we'll conclude because I think we're approaching our conclusion time. One point that came up in the comments, and I really feel like our audience is doing us a favor by asking such incisive questions, is one of the deep differences at the local community level is just really petty, like how do we expand the masjid? There's very heated opinions, factionalisms form, and the community becomes divided. And I would even say I remember hearing a presentation that kind of gave an overview of where Muslims are in terms of institutions in North America and the resources available to them. And this one, business analyst, who's a business analyst, said, well, actually, we end up devoting a ton of resources to adjudicating court cases because Muslims end up suing each other because they get divided over, issues that emerge in a masjid. And most of the time, those issues are not necessarily even theological, sectarian, ideological. They're just because we have, factions that are led by ego-driven people, that are more interested in holding on to seats of power than they are in uniting the community. So I think that this is kind of brings an important element to the issue. That what can we as a community do to both put into positions of responsibility people that have cooperative and collaborative virtues, that know how to listen, that know how to serve, that know how to bring people together. And I think that's maybe some of the things that we can start doing in our different masajid, is that we pay close attention to the characters of the type of people that we put into board positions, leadership positions in our organizations, at least in the Muslim minority context. I know this is kind of important. I want to end. We have 3 to 4 minutes. I want to end with what I think, since October has been on everyone's mind, and that's the genocide in Gaza. What has been the impact of what we're witnessing unfold in Gaza on this issue of unity and difference for Muslims? Like, I would like to hear your reflections, Professor Daifullah, and then we'll give the concluding remark, Professor Anjum.
I think, I will be perhaps stating the obvious that, and this was really at the back of my mind as well as I was reading and writing the response to this presentation, is kind of the magic of Gaza, is that it brought so many of us together, or that it really, as I was thinking of these questions of deep harm and grief and so on, this was, the Gaza images were flashing in my mind, as in, even with all these internecine conflict or violence or harm that we as Muslims have done upon each other or wreaked upon each other for the past, say, 200 years or so, having Gaza there just seemed to gel, even if in a momentary way. A lot of these otherwise resentful exchanges or sentiments. So I see this in part here as, again, like Dr. Anjum, I am a Muslim living in the West. So I've seen it amongst circles that have been disparate in my life for the past 20 years that I've been in the US. I've been kind of tuned into the more, maybe what Dr. Anjum calls the secularist progressive groups that have had a huge experience agitating for Palestine, and the Muslim community, which have been have been doing their own things, but on parallel and separate tracks. And I've seen these communities, for example, come together, forge groups, forge initiatives together, go out to protest together. And it has given me a lot of not only hope, but also food for thought about what happens when we have a unified goal. And I've also seen it in Egypt, for example, which is my home country, amongst groups, maybe within even my own family, who have deep political differences about the situation in the country. But when it comes to Gaza, there seems to be a red line that they wouldn't transgress, and definitely a sense of a unity of position about what Egypt should do, and where we stand vis-a-vis this tragedy. So yeah, these are kind of my very preliminary offhand thoughts on Gaza as a unifier of the ummah, despite the very, very heavy cost that we are all bearing, and our brothers and sisters there are bearing for that. May Allah make it in their balance in the day of judgment, and make it also a reason for bringing us together like none other has been in recent history. Amen.
Amen.
Professor Anjum?
Yeah, Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much, Dr. Daifullah. I think it's a beautiful comment, and I want to just echo your dua. May Allah make this the sacrifice of the people of Gaza as the beginning of the revival of the ummah and rise of the ummah. And I think that I have also seen and been inspired by the display of bravery, courage, of tawakkul, of solidarity in the people of Gaza. And I have seen that momentary solidarity, and my concern is precisely why, if there is a way to extend its half-life, right? So why is it so momentary, right? Why is it? It's a moment of truth, but why do we have to live with falsehood? Why can't we amplify this more? And I think that that's what this idea of ummatics and managing deep differences is concerned with, which is Gaza should never have happened. Palestine should never have happened. And it happened precisely because we were divided, and because we are creatures of aqidah, we are creatures of belief, and it is important that as Muslims, it is our aqidah that has kept us strong, right? It is when that half-charred body of a girl is taken out of the rubble in Gaza, she says, Al-Qudsu lana, then nobody can take that from us, that Jerusalem is ours. That faith is what is driving them. And it's that same faith that despite all their knowledge of the state of the ummah, they are asking the Muslims all over the world to come help them. And so that solidarity is, I think, it's our duty to think about it hard, to challenge our own falsehoods often, or mistaken assumptions about other Muslims, and notwithstanding the politics and notwithstanding very complex history, which is always constructed for particular interests, notwithstanding the differences, it is our aqidah, our belief that La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, what makes us Muslim, what makes us the Ummah of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, is the most important thing, it's the most powerful thing. And we must avoid the temptation of what psychologists call the narcissism of small differences, that precisely because we feel there is a lot in common, in order to identify, to protect our identity, we emphasize our differences. And then differences are all we spend our time debating, highlighting, because that becomes a badge of honor. I think that it is part of our religion and part of instructions in the Quran and in the Sunnah to avoid that narcissism. And that's why the Quran repeatedly speaks of baghi, which is mutual transgression, as the cause why people before us became divided, and why the honor of revelation was taken from them, why they lost God's favor. And that baghi is what I see as operative at the heart of many of these manifestations of injustice and inequality. And that requires bringing in our foundational principles. And this is the attempt that we're trying to make here. And I want to thank Miraj very much for having been such a wonderful conversation partner in that. I wish you had presented your own paper, which I thought was quite brilliant, and perhaps would have driven home the point better than mine. And I want to say the same to Yasmin. Your questions have really allowed me to understand my own position and hopefully expand on it and improve it, inshallah.
And with that, I'd like to finally thank our audience members for their incisive comments and incisive questions. And we pray to Allah that He grants us the unity that He commands us to have. And inshallah, we'll see you at the next colloquium. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.